Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle Children's Health and Wellbeing Assessment, a strength-based app to measure FNIM children's well-being with Dr. Nancy Young and Emily McDonald. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Serene Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle Manager. I'm Syilx Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. Joining us working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator, and our two production assistants, Kira and Nicole, and Emily will also be interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I will provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you're looking after yourself, and if at any point you need to talk to an elder, friend, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat for you if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Serene. I appreciate the warm welcome, and thank you to everybody who's here today. It's wonderful to have such a big group that we get to present to. So my name is Nancy Young, and I am on my journey to become an ally. I am a clinical epidemiologist by training, and my focus has always been measurement science. And for the past 15 years, I've had the honor of working with many Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities across Canada to integrate measurement science with traditional wisdom to find creative ways to help children talk about wellness. So I'm delighted to be here today. And I'm going to ask Emily McDonald if she wants to say a couple words. She's part of our team. Emily?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Emily McDonald. I am Mi'kmaq from Ma'apiuk First Nation located in Newfoundland. I am currently obtaining my Bachelor's of Social Work at Carleton University located in Ottawa. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. Looking forward to the questions in the chat in this presentation. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thanks, Emily. So if we're ready, I think we can start with the slides. And thank you to people for introducing yourselves in the chat. That's really wonderful. I always like to begin in a good way. This is actually a picture of Mary Jo Wabino's smudge bowl on her counter at home. And it reminds me of where the work began in Wickwamcong unceded territory, and that I have the honor and privilege of living on Atikamekw territory in Northern Ontario. And we've already had the opportunity for people to take a moment and acknowledge their territory, either in the chat or just in your own way. So thank you for that. Next slide. So the learning goals that we set out for today is that I'm going to introduce you to the Aaniish Naa Gegii, the Children's Health and Wellbeing Measure, which we've short formed to ACHWM, but there's a better name for it and many other names for it. So we'll talk about that partway through the presentation. It is a strengths-based assessment tool, and it's completed on an app by children and youth who are Indigenous. So we have versions for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children in Canada. The second thing I'm going to do is to really delve into the use of the ACHWM, and I'm going to challenge you to think about an example in your own community or organization of how you might think about applying it, just so that it is a more concrete process for you. But we will get to that partway through the presentation. That's just a heads up. I'm going to ask you to think about what gathering local data would mean in your community and how it might inform decisions in your community. And finally, I'm hoping that there's time permitting to add on one extra piece, which wasn't in the learning objectives, which is to explore the Wellness Resource Hub, which is something we have available to everybody on the website. And Emily is doing a lot of work on right now. So I'm going to take a minute to showcase a little bit of that. Next slide. So first goal, introduce the Aaniish Naa Gegii. Next slide. So ACHWM used to stand for Aboriginal Children's Health and Wellbeing Measure, and we were guided that the term Aboriginal was no longer appropriate several years ago. And we were also looking for a new name for the measure that the children could call it by, because ACHWM doesn't have any meaning to a child. And the children of Wikwemkong gave it the name Aaniish Naa Gegii, which means how are you in Ojibwe. So the A that was Aboriginal became the A from Aaniish Naa Gegii. We have a very long title, but most of the communities, the children call it by the local name. So in Wikwemkong, they would call it Aaniish Naa Gegii. It's a self-reported wellness assessment. It was developed with and for Indigenous children. So the only questions that are in it are questions that children were willing to be asked. And this is focused on children from 8 to 18 years of age. And it began in Wikwemkong Health Center in partnership with Laurentian University. My apologies for the background noise. It is now a partnership between the CHIO Research Institute and Wikwemkong Health Center. And that is because there were some financial challenges at Laurentian University that started in 2021. And for the security of the team, we made a choice to migrate to the CHIO Research Institute, which has been a wonderful home for us. So I work as a senior scientist at the CHIO Research Institute, and Emily is also employed there, as well as the other members of our team. Next slide. So why create a new measure? So I'm going to take us all the way back to 2009, when we had a conversation about creating a new measure. Because the community leaders, particularly in Wikwemkong, but in other communities, recognized that there was a health equity gap for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children. They also recognized that there was no child health data that was really relevant at the local level. So there's provincial level data, there's national data, that is wonderful, nothing against that data, but programs and services are planned locally. They're planned within First Nations. They're planned within Indigenous organizations. They're planned by local mental health teams. They didn't have the data that they needed that was specifically for their community. And there were no culturally relevant measures. It really came to a head with one of my PhD students who was trying to evaluate a land-based program, and we were trying to find a good measure for him to evaluate it. He took a visit to community to review the 12 measures that he had for them, and they did not like any of them. So we had a conversation about creating a new measure. Next slide. So it started with Mary Jo Wabino, who was the health director in Wikwemkong at the time. That role has transitioned, and Diane Jacko is now in that role, and Diane has been very much involved throughout, so they continue to be very involved. And myself, I was at Laurentian University at the time, but am now at the CHIO Research Institute. And it was a partnership between Indigenous leaders and several academic researchers to incorporate traditional wisdom, but also to ensure the scientific credibility of what came out. And I don't want to imply that Indigenous knowledge needs to be proven by Eurocentric research methods. That's not the case at all. However, it was the case that community said if they're going to use it, they want to use it with government to support their requests for funding, is one of the reasons they wanted data. And that needed good scientific evidence to convince government and other funders that what they were presenting was valid. So we wanted to ensure that it was scientifically sound, but we also wanted to ensure that it was relevant for Indigenous children across Canada. This was not started for one community. We actually took a trip to the West Coast to meet with some groups in BC to see if we could do this in collaboration from the beginning. But that's a hard start, and we decided to go back and focus on one community and share as it evolved. Next slide. So in 2010 and 2011, we conducted a series of focus groups, and we had Indigenous children, First Nations children specifically from Wickwamcong, who completed a photo voice exercise with us. And these are some of the photos that they took. But the photo on the top left is of the Medicine Lodge, where we began the day with with each of our focus group participants. So they started the day in a Medicine Lodge with food provided for the children, but also teachings provided to ground them in their culture as we began the day, to start in a good way. We had smudges every day that we did a group. And it was a wonderful experience, and that's a really warm memory for me. But children took pictures of things that later became the questions. So all of the items that are in the measure came from a photo of some sort, or sometimes they were a word, but mostly they were photos. So in the middle at the top, we have a picture that the girls talked about as being the importance of balance in their life. On the top right is a picture that we thought was about physical wellness, because it's the grounds where they play baseball, but it wasn't. The children explained to us that that picture showed the importance of language to them in their wellness, because the sign is written in Aaniish Naa Gegii. There's several pictures at the bottom, 2 pictures on the left that show the participants of the focus groups, and they were putting their ideas on a big medicine wheel in the community and telling their stories about what each one meant. The girls in that middle picture are putting stickers on to show which items were their favorite of all of the ones that were put up. And there's a picture on the bottom right of the boys taking pictures of each other, because long-term friendships are really important to your wellness. Next slide. So in all, we had 6 focus groups. There were 38 children who participated. They selected their best photos. They gave a name to the photos. Those photos and concepts were then put into quadrants. And all of this part was facilitated by people in the community. So while I was present, I was active out on the bikes with a group of kids and helping them out. But when it came to putting names and somebody to scribe the names onto the photos, those were all done by community members, because I was really cautious. I did not want to influence this process with my Western approaches to things. In all, they generated 58 questions that were related to health and wellness and really covered the spread. This is not about illness. It is about the whole continuum. And 4 additional questions were added later by other communities and also adopted by the Wickwamcong community. And this work was guided by an advisory committee. So I see more people are joining, which is wonderful. Welcome, folks. And there is a citation at the bottom of that page, which I realize is a little bit tiny, but it is where we published the original development work. And when we get a couple slides in, I'll show you all of the publications and where you can find them. Next slide. We've also assessed the fit in other communities. So 2014, 2015 was a big time for us to go around and work with other communities. ACHWM Family Services in Fort Frances was one of them, a Métis community in Sudbury, Chiging First Nation, Whitefish River First Nation, and the Ottawa Inuit Children's Center, which is now Inuit Naa Gegii Center for Inuit Children, Youth, and Families. This is where those 4 extra questions came from. But this is where we also realized that the core questions and the concepts were robust, and they did work across communities. They weren't unique to the Wickwamcong community. We actually came out of this consultation process with a group of items that are robust enough to cover First Nation, Inuit, Métis, with some minor tweaks within each to make sure that they do reflect the culture for those communities. Next slide. So in the process of sharing with other communities, we've also had names gifted to the measure by many communities. So the first gift is up on the right-hand side when Stan Wesley joined us with a group of children in Wickwamcong to give it the first name, which was Aaniish Naa Gegii. And I'd like to acknowledge our elder Rita Corbier, who's second from the left in the back row, who's been part of this and continues to be part of this today. But she was there, and she was the one who actually let the children know the proper spelling of Aaniish Naa Gegii, so they got it right. That's the name in Northwestern Ontario, but there's different dialects, and so Southwestern Ontario has a slightly different name, as does Pikangikum and as does Northwestern Ontario, but they're all variations on Anishinaabe. Kanwipe is the name that is given to it in Inuktitut, and there are names for many other cultures. So Kamansavo, Oniotanhachi, Wachea, Iglete. And I'm sorry, you folks in BC, I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation of the last one. So that might be something we can do in the Q&A. But all of the names translate to how are you? And that's what a grandma or a kokum would ask a child when they saw them, would ask their grandchild. And so it makes sense. We're asking them about wellness. We're asking them, how are you? Next slide, please. So in 2014 to 2016, we worked on putting this onto a tablet. And the rationale for putting it on a tablet was really to make sure that the data didn't sit on somebody's desk in the form of a piece of paper for extended periods of time, and that it actually got used, because we all know about doing surveys and somebody fills out all the forms and then you got to find somebody to do the data entry, and it goes on and on and on. Communities said that that would not work for them for very good reason. So we put it onto a tablet, but that tablet has many benefits. It supports children to answer the questions independently. So they get to see one question at a time. It's on a big screen. And it can talk to them. If they don't want to read it, it will actually show them the words as it's talking out loud. And it supports them to do this on their own with a pair of earbuds, preferably. It produces scores that are shared with the child in the form of a balance chart. It also generates an aggregated report that is automated and is for the community. So putting it on a tablet allows these things to happen in real time, and you don't have to wait a month to see your report. You can see the report with the children you've gathered as soon as you get to 20 children. And even that limit is something we can adjust for communities if we need to. It also connects children at potential risk to a local safety net. And I want to warn people that there are some questions in here that are sensitive. They're questions that the children told us we need to ask their friends. And that's why they're here, because all of the focus groups felt that they were important questions. But because those questions are there, we've put in a mechanism through the tablet to connect children to a local safety net. Next slide, please. So a brief assessment was developed in order to figure out who of the children really needed to be supported at the end of the day, and which of those sensitive questions was important to screen for. So the screening process was created by the staff at the Nadmadwin Health Clinic in Wickramakong. And Mary Jo and I had gone to them because there were a few sensitive questions in the measure that we were concerned about. They came back and told us there was 18 questions that they were concerned about and needed to be addressed immediately, depending on the answers. So they developed a system of red and yellow flags. A yellow flag is a minor concern, but not inconsequential, and a red flag is a more significant concern. Children need to be referred to a qualified local staff member if they have one flag or two yellow flags, one red flag or two yellow flags. And that's to ensure each child's safety. And I've said a qualified staff member, and I've been vague about that on purpose, because communities get to decide what that means. And that can mean different things, and we will talk about that a little bit later as well. So this brief assessment was developed in Wickramakong to help us figure out who among the children really needs to have a follow-up conversation. And we created a process to do that. Next slide. So these are some of the questions. These are actually all of the questions. They're tiny in the brief assessment form, but you can see if a child says, I feel afraid or scared always, and I feel bullied always, that's going to cause the tablet to let the person who's managing the tablet know once the child is finished that there needs to be a follow-up conversation. And we're not saying that this is a child at risk. We say this is a child at potential risk. It was a child answering a question independently on a tablet. Who knows what that means? There's a question about question 24, I feel safe at home. And a child might say hardly ever, which is a red flag. But we've had conversations with mental health workers where the children explain, well, there's a boogeyman under my bed, or there's a spider in the corner, or they don't feel safe at home because of those things. That's a conversation that needs to be had. That's a conversation that's easy to support and to say, well, let's talk about this and let's resolve this. No, that's not a child at risk, but it might be. Many of the children who say they don't feel safe at home, there's been serious concerns. So these are the questions that generate flags, and it is the local clinical team or a local health worker who decides if they're in need of further support or not in need of further support. We also cue them on this page to ask if there's currently somebody supporting them, and who is that, and can I share this with them, because we want to be really careful about respecting the child's privacy. At the same time, if they've already got a clinician or a social worker that's helping them, then it makes sense that this be shared if we can get their permission. Next slide. So all of the work that we've done has been grounded in 10 years of science. So 2013 to present, we've really been working on the science, and we've shown that the measure is reliable. Children can consistently answer the question, provided there's no real change that's happened between the two tests. It is valid. It's correlated 0.52 with the PEDS-QL measure, which is an American measure that's been used around the world, is very well researched. And we were quite happy with that correlation. Some people might say, well, that's a moderate correlation. It's a little bit on the low side. It's a little bit on the low side because the PEDS-QL does not have any culture in it. It doesn't have any spiritual questions in it. So we weren't expecting a perfect correlation. If we got a perfect correlation, then we didn't need a new measure to begin with. We could have just used the PEDS-QL. So this says it's a little bit different, but it's still the same general concept. Sensitivity and specificity, its ability to pick up children who need support, but also to not overcall how many children need support, is relatively good. So it has met all the psychometric properties. There's some pictures at the bottom of some of the publications where we've shared this. Next slide, please. And this is a paper that was published in 2019 by Mary Jo Wabineau and health directors in other communities who got together to pool their data to actually share what is a typical score. So if you were to use the measure and you got scores and you wanted to know, gee, are my scores similar to what they would score in another community, Manitoulin Island communities have got together to say, these are our scores. And present them in a way that is easy for communities to pick up and do a comparison. And you don't have to compare. It's just an option that's there. Next slide. So these are some of the publications that we have. So we have done a fair number of publications in order to make sure that the science is there. Next slide. I don't want everybody to read that slide, because we're going to get the link to the page that has most of our publications posted in the chat for you. It's up here. It's also on our website. If you go into ACHWM.ca, into research, into, I think it's articles, you can find most of them there. So this has been a balancing process for us. Our community reports always come first. There are more community reports than there are peer-reviewed papers. However, the community reports are private. So the academic pieces are the ones that we can put out publicly. And we do want to share with people and let them know that the information that they need, if it's not there, they can get it from us. There's also a contact us page on our website. So if you ever want to reach out and get more information, just fill in the contact us form and we will get back to you. But the community reports, I do have an example of one, but I did not put it in the slides. I have created one with fake data so that I can share community reports if needed. Next slide. So let's talk about the ACHWM and where it is today. So we talked a lot about the history and the things that we have done. What are we doing now? Next slide, here we go. So the core values that guide the ACHWM are really important. Next. So the first is that we always consider what is best for each child. That's a core piece that's helped us every time we run into trouble. Children's wisdom really guides our process, and their best interests guide our local triage and support process. We believe every child is deserving of support. So that's why the brief health assessment is still really important to us. Our second value is that we respond to the needs of each community, and we respect each community's autonomy, which means communities are the decision makers on this. And I do want to remind you that the ACHWM is a wellness tool. It's not a diagnostic tool. It's an opportunity for children to talk about their wellness. So with that in mind, we put the children first. We make sure that we respond to the needs of community. And none of this is about gathering academic data anymore. We do have a few small research projects that are going on, but most of what we're doing and most of what the team is supporting is outreach. So the ACHWM today has 12 versions. So there's English versions, French versions, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. So that's 2 times 3 gives you 6. And then we have standard version versus family services. So family services is for any children who are in care, whether it's a customary care arrangement or otherwise. If they have multiple families, there's a family services version that has questions with plurals that just seem much easier for children who are in a multiple home, multiple family situation. There's a screening and triage process. So we talked about the brief health assessment that is now built into the tablets. There's automated online reports that communities can go in and pull off of our website whenever they need them. They don't need our permission. They have regular access to that information. We've got a comprehensive website that has checklists and training resources, and the team's just in the process of updating them. So there will be some new information presented there. And we have an amazing team of experts, which includes Emily McDonald, who support communities. So the pie chart on the right just shows you the breakdown of the questions. So 16 of our questions are spiritual, 24 are emotional, which is mental. According to Western training, it's more mental health. The 9 mental questions are really about cognition and problem solving, and then 13 physical health questions. And that is a little bit imbalanced, but this is where the children took us, and we're following their wisdom. Next slide. So the children complete it on an app. This is what the tablet looks like. There is one question presented at a time. This is the first general question. How would you describe your health this past month? That's a very common question that was not created by the children, but that's a starting point. And it actually doesn't go into the aggregate score because it wasn't generated from the children. But it shows you that there's a question, there's 5 response options, there's a pause button in the top right if they need to take a break. There's a speech button in the top left, so they can turn on and off the audio. They get tired, they can't read a word, they can turn the audio on. And they can choose whether to go to the next question without answering or not. And they can go back to previous questions. So if something makes them think about something else, they can say, oh, I don't think I answered that previous one right. I'll go back. So they can go forward and back. They can skip questions if they choose. Next. So here's a few more questions that are actually in the summary score. So I have time to be with my family. I laugh and have fun. our native language is not important, a little important, important, very important, or extremely important. So there's 2 different response sets in it, and there are 62 questions in it, which is a lot, but it takes the children about 10 to 15 minutes to do it. Takes them longer if they listen than if they just go through the questions with the audio off. But so far, almost everybody turns the audio on. So you need Wi-Fi to get your tablet set up and to get the questions into them and have them running. Once you've done that, it runs completely offline. So we've had people take the tablets out into the bush to do it in a land-based activity with the children. You will need Wi-Fi again at the end if you want to upload your data so that you can get a report from it. But those things can be done intermittently, so it doesn't have to be constantly online, which is really important in many communities. Next slide. So it generates reports first for each child or youth. So that's based on their individual data. Then for local health workers, which is also individual data. And then reports for community leaders, which is grouped data or aggregate data. So there's different layers of reporting that are all generated beginning with the tablet. Next. So the child report, the child sees a balance chart, which is a picture that highlights their strengths. So it shows the spiritual, emotional, mental, or physical and mental. In this case, the spiritual in the north is the strength for this child. So we would guide that local health worker to start with the strength and to celebrate that spiritual and ask the child about it. And what do you do to grow your spiritual wellness? And they might say, well, they're a jingle dress dancer. And that could lead to a conversation about who do you do that with and who else is there. And oh, my auntie does it with me. And that's a cue to, okay, if we need some supports for this child down the road, auntie's already involved. She's a natural helper. Let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Next. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the data sovereignty, because clearly there is data that's being put into tablets that's going somewhere. Next. So we do follow the OCAP principles, and I think there's a timing on this. So next. So ownership piece. So the web portal actually allows communities to control their own data. Every community's data are separated from other communities' data, and they can choose sole ownership or shared ownership of the data. So there are ways to do this without uploading any data. Control is in the hands of the local community leaders. They can add or remove team members from their project. They can add or remove their data from the REDCap server. And the data is stored on a REDCap server in the academic world. It is not in community yet, although that's in my dreams still, and I'm still working on it. Access, we give them access to online reporting controlled by passwords. They can also access their raw data online. Everything's password controlled. Next. And possession. So they can, data downloads are available to them as well. We as the ACHWM team are really stewards of the data. I don't go into people's data. If there's a problem and they say, I need you to change this one ID number, we typed it in wrong, that's fine. I will go in and I will do the edits for them. But other than that, we don't go into communities' data. It's not our place. Next slide. Oops, sorry. And there's the opportunity, sorry, I've got to move the pickup box. Opportunity to request permission to use the data for secondary analysis. So from time to time, we have gone back to say, hey, can we pool your data with a couple of other communities to answer a question? And it's always very precise, and it's easy for communities to say yes or no. Next slide. We also follow the IQ principles, which are Inuit principles, which are not exactly the same as OCAP, but they are important principles to consider, and they very much overlap with the 7 grandfather teachings and other teachings that are part of the Indigenous culture across Canada. Next slide. So I'm going to go back to some of the benefits of using a measure. Is with children, it actually gives them a voice. They have told things to the tablet that people are very surprised by, but it's much easier to do when you're talking to an inanimate object. And children these days, particularly post-COVID, well, I don't know if we're post, but during COVID, are becoming very tech savvy. It was developed with Indigenous children, and the wisdom that's in it is theirs. And I think that's important to honor their wisdom. It is culturally relevant and grounded in the medicine wheel. And while I know there are many medicine wheels across Canada and many different teachings, these are the teachings that we started from and we continue to honor. It's scientifically sound. The tablet actually is very engaging for children. It has become sort of our secret to getting children to talk about some difficult things from time to time. The automated process enhances the feasibility and supports the generation of local data. It's way easier to figure out how to use a tablet than to figure out how to do data entry on your paper data. And it generates quantifiable data that you can use at the local level. So we will tell you that we're concerned if you report cell sizes under 5, but we won't tell you you can't do it. It's your data. Next slide. So our learning goals are to delve into the use of the ACHWM and think about gathering local data to inform community-based decisions. Next slide. So I'm going to show you how it works, but as we go through this, I want you to think about the next question I'm going to ask you is, think about a context that might be helpful to use this in your community that we can work through this process with you thinking about. So this starts in the east. So we enter the circle from the east and the child sits with the tablet and completes the survey. That data then produces a balance chart that the child can review with the support of a local mental health worker. And that local mental health worker, or could be elder, could be a natural helper who's got good training, also gets to see the results from the brief health assessment form. So those flags that we talked about earlier, or those concerning responses, are available to the local health worker prior to having that conversation. So while she's talking about strengths from the balance chart, she's also knowing that she needs to at some point check to see whether any of the concerns are things that need to be addressed immediately. That data, if the community decides to upload it, and not all communities upload, but most, I'd say probably right now everybody is, but we've had periods of time where communities choose not to upload. If you upload it, it will generate a community report. So it's about a 10-page report that says, here's your data and here's what it looks like. Next. That community report can be used to inform local decisions about what kinds of programming should be happening in the community, which then goes back to support the wellness of the children who completed the measure to begin with. Next slide. So I warned you this question was coming. How could you use the ACHWM? And it doesn't have to be, oh, I'm absolutely going to do this, but come up with an example that's relevant to you in the context of your community to just think about this. Next. So remember, this is a well-being assessment. It's tablet-based. It's for 8 to 18-year-olds. It's you looking at holistic health, and it's going to generate reports for you. So as you think about what's your example, I want you to think about what's your example that has these parameters around it that would allow you to work with 8 to 18-year-olds in particular. So hopefully people have an idea, and I'm going to keep going. Next slide. So given that you've got this way that you want to use it, I want you to think about what your purpose is. So is your example one where you're thinking about using it in clinical assessment, maybe using it as a triage tool to help you manage your caseload? That's one option. Are you thinking about doing it in population health assessment? So some communities have done it as part of the back to school assessment for children and youth, or as a way to screen for children who need more support as they start into the school year. And the third option is program evaluation. So are you looking at evaluating one of your existing programs to figure out not if it works, but who it works for? So those are different categories you could put your idea into. Next slide. So clinical assessment would be the child completing the survey that they would connect to local supports, and then you do a reassessment. Next, population health assessment is to assess where the children in the community are at and to really look at automated community reports and de-identify data. And I need to come back and talk about that in a minute. And we also offer an analytic spreadsheet. So the first blue and white graph at the top or table at the top is a picture of what the raw data output would look like with some filters and things on it so that you have all the raw data. That's where the de-identified piece comes in. We don't collect any personal information on this. We ask that communities create an ID for each child who completes it, something that's meaningful to the community but means absolutely nothing to us. So I can't tell you who's who. I do collect information on age as part of this, or we do, but there are no days of birth. So we collect year and month because we don't want identifying information in the data. At the bottom of that page, you see a report, which looks like an Excel spreadsheet because it is, and it's a way to generate your own pie charts, but filter them. So if you say, well, I really want to look at my older youth group, and I have some younger kids in here, so let's filter them out. You can apply filters very easily. They're set up. You don't need to be an expert in Excel to run it. We've made it so that communities can manipulate their data and ask questions of their data without the support of a statistician, because that's a resource most communities don't have readily available. And the smaller picture on the right-hand side of the page is basically showing you what the automated report would look like. It would be a series of graphs and just information that comes directly from the tablet. Next slide. So if you chose to do a program evaluation with it, you might use the ACHWM at several points in time. And I've showed a graph here that's saying some imaginary wellness program, we look at it pre, we look at it post, the scores go up, which for the ACHWM is a very good thing and shows that your program is leading to success. Next slide. So questions to ask yourself. So if you're thinking about using this in, let's use program evaluation for an example. So land-based program you want to evaluate. Do you have enough children to generate meaningful data? So if there's 5 children in the program, you will get some data, but there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around what the results mean because it's a very small group. If you've got 20 or more, you're probably in excellent shape to answer a couple of questions about program evaluation. Second question that's important is what resources are available in your community. And there's 2 types of resources that are important. The most important among them is the staff. So do you have enough staff members or natural helpers or affiliated mental health staff that you could pull in to support participating in children and youth? And that's really important. We'll come back to that a couple times in this presentation. Do you have secure storage? So there is some identifiable data. There are consent forms in most communities that need to be stored in the communities. There's rosters, there's brief health assessment forms and referral forms. So you just have to think about, do I have a secure storage solution for that information? Because we ask communities to hold any identifiable information within the community. Next slide. So local health workers are essential. They are so important. So you need to choose someone with the skills and preparedness to support children and youth at all levels of need. So we don't want to think about this as something that you connect children in crisis with supports. Yes, that's hugely important. But if you have a child who scores really well, you also need to connect them to leadership programs and opportunity for growth. And so to think about somebody who understands that whole scope within the community and can connect children to a mix of natural helpers or crisis support workers, have the brief conversations if you need to about risk, about preparing a safety plan. They also need to be trusted within the community. So in some cases, it's been elders. In most cases, it's been counselors or social workers. In a few cases, it's been nurse practitioners. Next slide. So you really need to plan ahead with your local health workers to do the brief assessment, because you really can't start this process until you have this piece in place. And I want to remind you that there are children who are identified as that potential risk because of one red flag or two yellow flags. So the local health workers need to be prepared to have those conversations to say, is that real? And what's the next step? But we also encourage them to start with the balance chart, start with strengths, and then get into the brief assessment form, which helps identify children who may be at risk and guide them to supports in the community. So we're trying to avoid this whole refer children out of the community. Worst case scenario, they're airlifting children out of community. Let's keep it local. Let's keep it as a relatively normal part of the process that we're going to connect everybody to a few more supports. Next. So the balance chart. So this is a bigger picture, actually two pictures of the balance chart, because it does come in different colors. And it provides them with a real-time visualization of their strengths and their opportunities. And it highlights spiritual, emotional, physical, and mental wellness. And on the top one, you can, if your eyes are really good, you can see that there are numbers in that balance chart. So it says spiritual is 77 and physical is 87. So in this case, physical is the strength. We don't show children the numbers. We discourage our communities from showing children the numbers. The bottom chart has the numbers hidden. So where the numbers were is actually the color for the legend. So they can say, oh, green is spiritual in this one, orange is emotional. That's what the child sees, and the conversation should focus on the biggest piece of the pie. Next slide. So here's the numbers in a bigger format. So the numbers are a little bit different, but again, physical is the strength in this one, and communities can pick what color they want. And if you double click on the title at the top, the numbers go away. And so you can present it to the child and talk about their relative strengths without getting fixated on numbers. Next slide. So the brief health assessment, we talked about it, and I showed you the part of this slide that's on the right. I showed you all the questions that lead to flags. What the tablet generates is on the left under the heading of record. It shows the participant ID that was created by the community and the date the child started and finished the measure. But on the right-hand side of that one image, it shows you the scores, and those are the scores that get fed into that balance chart. At the bottom, it also shows you any flags. So this was a child who had 3 yellow flags, so would be identified at being at potential risk. We also count up how many flags they miss. If they skip a flagged question, it still shows up, but instead of being a yellow or a red flag, it's a question mark, because we don't know the answer, but we know they skipped it. And skipping it is often an indicator as well. So that's the information the mental health worker has to go from when she's having her conversation, or he's having their conversation, is the balance chart, which is based on the scores, and a list of what the flags were that were triggered by that child, so they can log them in the back of their head and say, you know what kind of conversation do I have to have? This doesn't look like a child who's at imminent risk, but they need to go through the local processes and figure that out according to local protocols. Next slide. So getting started, if you were to want to get started, you would start by creating a login and doing some learning online. There's a variety of documents and videos. There are live training sessions that happen monthly. And so they're, I think, usually posted in our Facebook page as well as tweets related to the monthly training sessions. And Emily can put some of that information in the chat as we go along as to where to register for the next training session. And one of the pieces you have to do is choose your agreement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. Next slide. So agreements. We haven't talked about agreements yet, but clearly there must be some kind of understanding of who's responsible for what. So that's what our agreements do. And the main focus of the agreements is that we have a good, wholesome conversation about this, that nothing is a surprise, not that we're trying to legally bind communities. But we tell communities that they are responsible for providing the local health resources. And in most cases, not all, but most cases, they have their own tablets or iPads. If that's a barrier, we loan them to communities. It's not a problem. But the local health workers are the secret sauce and are the reason this works well. And so that's an important piece that community needs to know, that that's their responsibility. And it doesn't have to be from necessarily within local staff. If they've got a partner agency that provides those resources, that's fine too. Community is responsible for the children's well-being. So the odd time we do identify a child in crisis, we tell communities, you follow your local crisis protocol. We helped you identify that that's where the child is at. You have protocols and procedures for what happens next. Just follow them. We're not trying to bring in new processes for that part of it. And we tell the community that in most cases, based on the agreement, they are the owners of the data. The one difference is if it's a research piece, then they might be co-owning the data with an academic partner. It doesn't have to be us. We had one group that was partnered with the University of Manitoba, and they just need to understand that they're sharing the data. The ACHWM team, myself, Emily, and our colleagues are responsible for providing resources via the website, which includes the app, and stewardship of the data. So we will house the data for people with no cost. And there is no licensing fee. That's always the piece people assume there has to be costs. We have good financial support coming from CIHR, Health Canada, and the province of Ontario right now. So there are no licensing fees. There won't be licensing fees down the road. It's not something that Mary Jo and I can get our heads ever wrapped around. So it's important that this is barrier-free, and funding is always an issue for communities. Next slide. So there's 3 types of agreements. People can choose whether they want to use it independently or as part of a collaborative practice or as research. So this guides who can see their data and how their data is used. So if it's independent, it's totally owned by the community. We can't see any of it, but it also means we're limited in the support we can provide. We can't back up their data because we don't have it. We can't do the automated reporting because we don't have access to their data. And there's no opportunities to publish, which is usually not a thing that communities are interested in. But they do own their data. And in all cases, the ethical approvals and consent processes are governed by the community or by the ethics of the academic partner if you're involved in research. 95% of our partners are doing collaborative practice, which basically gives them ownership of the data. We have the opportunity to provide reports and things and back up data for them, but we don't publish their data. And research is always intended to be published, so it's a bit of a different animal, and the data is shared. Next slide. So once you've figured out what kind of agreement you have, and that's a relationship between your organization and our group, then you get to set up your project. And once you have a little project, which is basically the vault you're going to put the children's data in and the app that controls the tablet, you can assign different roles to members of your team. A lot of teams only have one person. There's somebody in the community who's running this. It might be a clinician who's just doing it within their practice. So they just have a project leader. That's all they have. You don't have to have multiple people with multiple roles. But in some of the schools, we've had high school students who want to help out with the junior students when they're doing it. Okay, well, we want them to be able to help, but we don't want them to be able to see the flags because we don't want to trigger our high school students. So there's a helper role that you could assign somebody like that to. They can run the app, but they can't see the results. Once they get the results, they would have to say, okay, I'm going to take this to a facilitator or a coordinator or somebody who's got higher level access, who can actually see those results and connect them to the mental health worker. So there's different access points. We recently added a data viewer to the process because some communities have an analyst that they're working with who just wants to be able to access things on their own and not be emailing data around. So we created that role, which is quite limited, but actually allows them access to the online reports and to download data online. So they can export the data. But they can't delete the project, which was the problem we were having. Anybody who wanted to share it with a data person was giving them project leader access in order to let them export the data. But that meant they could delete the project, and that wasn't something the analyst should be doing. So we created a new role in response to community request. Next slide. So the project leader is the one most have. So the reports, we've talked a few times about the reports. Next slide. So it produces multiple reports. So we've talked about the child-specific results and the balance chart. We've talked about the information for the local health worker. I want to talk about the community level online reports, which are available after the 20th participant, only because we're trying to discourage broadly sharing information that could potentially be identifiable. There's general information on the participants that's included in that. So age, gender, we do have a they, them gender option within it, but it's not operational in the current app. It's very close to being done. It's finished, just not applied yet. There are summary and quadrant score graphs that are in it. There's detailed item level results. So if you're doing a bullying program, you really want to know what the answer to the bullying question is in your community, you can pull that out of the item level reports that are provided. Next slide. So this was the balance chart, and we talked about that. And next. So this is the individual participant summary that is intended for your local health worker to review. Next. And these are some of the pictures that come out of the aggregate report that is available for communities to download. So it shows you that global health rating question that 12% said excellent, 24% said very good, and so on. And it shows you the same thing, but in a pie chart. So if you're interested in looking at it in a different format, in a graphic format, it's already there. And if you download the analytical spreadsheet, you can regenerate that for subgroups within your data. And on the right is showing you a distribution of the spiritual scores. It'll say this is what spiritual scores look like in the community, which overall is pretty good. But there's a small group of children and youth who have scores below 50, which is concerning. So there might be a group that we need to think about, is there a different program that's needed for them? Their spirituality is not where the rest of the group is. Or is it just that that's where they are on their learning journey, and that's okay? Those are decisions communities can make with their data. Next slide. So this is part of the auto-generated report. One of the questions we ask children is, what do you do to stay active? These are made up answers. They're relevant, but they're not from children. I just want to be honest about that. Anything that we share is usually fake data because I don't want to publicly share a child's data. But we will generate a word cloud as part of the report with the most common words that came up in the response to what do you do to stay active. Next question, or next slide. So a few questions that you can ask yourself. So I asked you to think about an opportunity that you might have to gather data in your community. Now I want you to think about, what will the community learn from those results? So if you go and collect all that data, what'll the community learn? Will you have enough participants to actually produce something that convinces you that, yeah, this program works, or no, there's a subgroup in this program that really needs something else? How will you support children at potential risk? So those children who have flags, how will you support them? Think about what resources are available in your community. So who are your natural helpers? Who are your local health workers? Do they have the skills that they need? Do they know the referral processes and who to refer to? Do they know the crisis protocol? And will you be able to support those children at risk? Who are the staff members in your organization who will lead this? So who gets to control the adding different members to the project? Who gets to download the data? Those are all the pieces you have to figure out. And where will you store the confidential information? So consent forms, for example. Next slide. So I'm going to do a very quick recap, and then I'm going to show you some of the Wellness Hub resources. Next. So this process gives children a louder voice. We used to say it gives them a voice, and then we realized, no, they've already had a voice. It's just we're not listening. So let's ramp up the volume. Next. So they need new ways to start conversations about wellness, and the ACHWM is tablet-based, non-judgmental, and it helps children be heard. So Samantha Mendaman talks about it gives them a microphone, and I really like that piece. So how will you use the tablets to support children and youth in your community? Next slide. It connects children to local supports. So when children speak, we need to listen, and this is a way that helps us listen. Next, to truly understand their needs, to integrate strengths-based conversations. That's been a big change for some communities. To connect them to supports within their communities. We don't want to be referring out if we can avoid it. So what does your community offer for children and youth in terms of support? Who will those people be? Next. And it produces data to inform local decisions. So it's helped communities and organizations in a variety of ways. Next. So it supported funding applications. For example, the building of a shelter was built in part on our bullying and our not feeling safe at home data. It bolsters advocacy for arts and cultural programming. It has informed plans for land-based programs. So there's no point in collecting data if you're not going to have a use for it. So think about, how will you use that data to create impactful change? So want to learn more? We're going to go through these a little bit quickly, but you can sign up at achwm.ca. Next. Oh, skip that one. Next. Here's what the member login looks like, and you would have to click the create an account button in the bottom left, put in what you want for your username and password. Yep, next. And it'll bring you to this page. We're not asking for a ton of information. Most of this is optional, but there are a few things like your name that you have to put in. Next. We'd love it if you put a picture into it. It really helps us. You can continue learning about the ACHWM once you have a login, but there's also live training sessions. The member portal also has video tutorials and many other things. There's a demo version of the app that you can get access to, so you can play with it. The demo version is short. It has 10 questions. There's no triggering questions in it, so you can play with it. And if you have trouble, we have a team that will support you. Next. So this is a picture of some of the learning center things, the getting started guides, the profile and passwords, different parts of it that you can learn through here. Next. So I want to take just 5 minutes and then we'll get to question and answers. And I know there's a few popped up in the chat to explore the Wellness Resource Hub. Next. So this grew out of what was a rapid response grant. It was a rapid response knowledge synthesis grant that was funded by CIHR early in the pandemic, when I had a team that couldn't go into community and we couldn't support children. I said, we got to find a different way. So we started creating resources and sharing them online during the pandemic. And the goal is for it to be a continuous knowledge exchange. Next slide. So the development of it was really collaborative. We reached out to people who support children and youth to think about what they needed. We reached out to local mental health workers. We reached out to local artists. We tried to follow best local practices. We co-created activity sheets. There are some workbooks, and there are some facilitator guides as well for some of the programming. Next slide. So these are some of the pictures of things that you'll find in there, things like walleye breathing, which is based on traditional teaching and helps children learn breath control in a way that fits with their culture. This doesn't fit with your culture. I'd love it if you fixed it and sent it back to us, because what's right for one culture is not right for other cultures, but it might give you an idea of something analogous in your teachings that you could adapt this. Next slide. So here's one of the adaptations that's been done to put it into Inuktitut and as a butterfly breathing exercise. Next slide. This is a coloring page that was created by Nagani. And we allow the artists, we encourage them actually to sign their artwork if they'd like to, because one of the things that we subscribe to is a Creative Commons license, which means you have to attribute things to where they came from. And this came from Nagani, but it's just such a different coloring page than most of what you'd see. And she left space in the middle for them to put a positive affirmation if they chose to, or to draw a picture of somebody if they chose to. They can do what they want with it. Next slide. This is another breathing activity, but instead of a box, it's a canoe. Next slide. This is another piece that was created by the team to talk about the people that they love and the people who make you smile, and really celebrating Turtle Island. Next slide. And that takes us to questions and answers. And I'm happy to come back and talk about the Resource Hub. Emily McDonald has also agreed to hop on with us to help with questions and answers. And so I will let Saran guide us from here.
Thank you for that, Nancy. That was great. We have a few questions regarding urban communities. I just have it here. So it says, has the well-being assessment been used in urban Indigenous communities that do not only have Indigenous-led leadership at the community level, like not nation specific? If so, where does the data stay in respect to OCAP principles?
That's a really good question, and one that we've struggled with for a while. We do have non-Indigenous organizations that have used it with children who are Indigenous. School boards is an example, children's aid societies is an example. Most of the children's aid societies we're involved with are actually child well-being agencies, which in Ontario are run by Indigenous communities. Where the data goes is to the organization. So the first time we came across this was with one organization that served about 10 First Nations. And we had this conversation about whose data was it, and it belongs to the organization. So the organization holds the data. However, we did ask them to go back to their partner communities to inform them that they were gathering data and to agree to share the aggregate results back to the community. But there was a big question about whether a child's data should go back to the community. And one of the things that children told us was that they go to the urban centers sometimes because they want anonymity. So if we sent their data back to their community, we'd have to ask them to identify as what community they came from. And right now we're not asking much identifying information. And B, we would be giving their data back to a place that they might not want it to go. And so the children coming first meant that where the children are getting their services is where their data goes. So it's not a perfect answer, but as best we can tell, that is honoring the child's control of their data. In a few cases, we've moved data from one project to another, which might be a child completing it at the school, and then we've shared the data with the health center. That only ever happens with a child's consent. So we try and make sure the child controls the data first, the community controls the data second. Does that help?
Yeah, that answers a few questions. Thank you very much. And then we have another question. The next question is, are sex and gender asked about within this tool? And if so, how? How does this apply to the OCAP principles?
So we do ask them about gender, about identifying. They don't have to identify. There is a choose not to identify option, and that's really only used by the community if they want to analyze their data by gender. Sometimes there's different programming that they want to put in place for a specific gender so they can analyze that data, but we don't use it for any other purposes. Certainly we're not trying to identify the children with it.
And then our next question is, were there any barriers to utilizing the technology, a tablet in communities, and how did you problem solve with those barriers in order for that participation with the tablets to be successful?
Yes, so one of the barriers that we spent a fair bit of time on was printing the brief assessment report. So early in 2015, 2016, we were offering communities the opportunity to print that brief assessment form right off the tablet to a Wi-Fi enabled printer. That became hugely problematic because everybody had different tablets. They were of different versions of operating systems. They printed in different ways. And sure enough, we'd get everything going. Somebody would be in the process of data collection, and that morning there would be an update that happened to their tablet that deactivated the printer. So the print function was abandoned because our community staff said, you know what, it's like 3 flags. I can transcribe those onto a piece of paper way faster than I can fuss with the printer. So we ended up abandoning the printing option and giving people a piece of paper that they can mark off which flags were raised by a child. So that was one that we conceded defeat, that we weren't going to win with the printer. Now that was quite a while ago, and printers are getting more sophisticated. So I've asked my IT guys again to have another look at that. But other than the printing function, the tablets have been really easy for communities to manage. They've been easy for the kids to use. We haven't had a lot of problems, but we do also say that the first day that somebody's collecting data, please contact your ACHWM person ahead of time and say, hey, we're doing our first child on the 21st. And whoever is the ACHWM team member who's responsible for supporting them will make sure that they don't have anything fixed in their calendar, that what they're doing can move if the community needs some online troubleshooting. And in some instances, we'll go to community. We'll say, you know what, can somebody go to this community for their first day to help them over that hurdle? Because the getting started is a big hurdle. If somebody comes and holds your hand, it makes it so much easier. And so for some communities, our team has done that.
That's great. Sounds like a great support system. That leads us into our next question. How does this tool support the children and the family as a whole?
So the family is a part we still are working on. That's probably not our strength, but something that we are aware of. So it supports the child in that the child then gets to have a conversation about wellness, and somebody can sort of guide them in terms of direction to go to get more support or to just grow their wellness and achieve better balance. The parent comes in if the child in that conversation with the local worker talks about having support from their family. So if the child is saying, you know, I'm just feeling sad all the time, I don't really have very many friends, this is not a good thing for me, they can say, you know, have you talked to your mom about this? And what does she think about this? And if they say, you know, mom hasn't been part of the conversation, well, could I help you to bring mom into the conversation? Maybe we book an appointment, or maybe I just have a quick phone call with your mom to let her know how you're feeling so that your immediate family can provide more support. It's there informally, but we don't have a formal process to engage with family other than through the consent process, and if the child is willing to have family brought in the local mental health worker assessment piece. I'm not sure if I answered that one fully, so if you want to follow up, I'm happy to.
I think you answered it well. Our next question is, how can regional health authorities and provincial health departments use and or support the use of this tool? Can a variation of it be used by government departments to make our children health and well-being assessments more culturally appropriate? Recognizing the challenge of wanting to make sure we're following OCAP principles at the same time.
Yeah, so when we think about the province, they play a huge role because they hold the purse strings for some of the funding that supports Indigenous people, particularly funding for agencies within the province. So they do have a critical role. I think one of the ways they can do it is in partnership with community organizations to say, you know, we're happy to support you to gather more data so that you have a common metric. I don't think the government will be the holder of the data, but the government could certainly encourage local organizations to use it and share whichever portions of the aggregate report they're comfortable with. So we have funding from Health Canada. They would love to have the data on all the communities that we're working with. We actually share the number of communities we work with and the regions those communities come from, but we don't share names of communities. One of the things we do if somebody starts a project is part of the agreement form is, can we talk about your community? Yes or no? Like, can we use the name of your community? So if somebody calls and says, hey, who else is doing this in BC? I'll have to go and check my database and figure out who's got an active project that's agreed to let me share their name, because we do hold that sort of confidence with communities. But I think the province has a huge role and a huge opportunity. And in Ontario, we've had some support from the province, which means we've got somebody who can support communities within the province. And we're a pretty small group. At most, we've been 10. I think right now we're around 6 or 7. And we do our best to support communities, but we would welcome more support from the province to support the communities or agencies within their province to do this. There's not a huge cost, like we don't charge fees for it, but there's time costs, right? So communities need staff to hold the tablets and staff to follow up with the children. So it is not totally free in that sense. There is an investment that's made by communities, and the province could help there. In Ontario, our biggest need is more mental health staff to support Indigenous children and youth. And the province could play a huge role there. And it needs to come back to training, which I think the pandemic is a good thing for, because we've learned to train people virtually. And we know that there are so many people who live in First Nations who can't leave their community because their children are there, their support structure is there, they can't leave for training. I have this wonderful idea of a new virtual or predominantly virtual online training that could be offered to build up the support structures within Indigenous communities, particularly remote First Nations. And I think the province has a big role to play there too.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you have an example of a program evaluation project that can use the ACHWM program?
Yeah, so we've actually got one that we've published, and Koyo Yusuba was the first author, and I'm just going to see if I can find it and put it in the chat, but Emily might be faster than I am. He comes up a few places. There it is. So there's a DOI at the end of this. Okay, so I just posted it. It was in the Journal of Outdoor and Environmental Education. So it was the land-based program that started the initiative. Back in 2009, Stephen Ritchie was a PhD student and was trying to evaluate a canoe trip and its impact on resilience. He ended up using the RS14, which is a mainstream measure, with the caveat that he would not do that again. They were going to let him do it once, but we needed to find a better way going forward. And so he came back many years later and did the same program evaluation with the ACHWM and found a bigger impact than he'd found with the Western measure the first time. But that's an academic publication that's actually a good example of a program evaluation.
Thank you. And we have our last question here. Just wondering, I know you mentioned cost was not, there was no fee or anything. This person's just wondering, is there a cost of applications outside of Ontario?
No, there is not. Within Canada, we have not had a cost for it. We've even worked with one group in the US, and we're not proposing to charge people for it. It adds a barrier that's not necessary.
And that was our last question. Thank you so much for telling us about your guys' program and how it taught us how to run the application, how the data can be used for developing community programs, or just learning more about the children and youth in communities. And yeah, so thank you to all our guests and to everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Dr. Nancy Young and Emily McDonald, for the amazing discussion. Just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming UBC Learning Circles. We have Healing from Trauma on April 20th. That is with Tordy Johnson, Veronica Haddon, Henry Morgan, and Sandra Harris. That'll be at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then we have the past, present, and co-developed future of services for children and youth with support needs. That's on May 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All our webinars are free to sign up for at our website at www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next Learning Circle. Lim lived. Thank you.